All right, so I'm meeting today with Professor Hosffman Ospino, who is a pretty influential scholar in terms of ministering in the U.S. context for those who are natives of Latin America, or even those who have ancestry in Latin America but live in the U.S. Um, he travels around as a very popular lecturer in many venues and has done some really important empirical research on how the U.S. Catholic Church is or is not meeting the needs of the growing numbers. And in fact, we're really becoming an Hispanic church here in the U.S. in many ways. So thank you for joining me today for a little conversation about the synod that's coming up or that's going on. I've been paying attention to many of the documents that have come out and have been looking at the Instrumentum laboris. And one of the things that stands out to me is if you look around in the media and social media and many Catholic magazines and other places, a lot of the conversation is focused around LGBT inclusion and the possibility for a women's diaconate. But when I look at the actual synod documents, those seem to be, I mean, they're there, but they seem to be rather minor issues for a much bigger picture of what's going on. And I wondered what you would have to say. What do you think are actually the big issues that the synod is trying to address, and what might be accomplished in this October session?
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity, James, and the invitation to reflect with you about the Synod and in light of the Instrumentum Laboris, this document of preparation for the conversations in October. I think that the two issues that you named remain very important, and yet they are not the only ones. And what happens is that sometimes our media, Catholic media, but also secular media, of course, they want to go for the juicy conversations, the conversations that generate some instinctive reactions on the part of Catholics, non-Catholics, and definitely, the inclusion of LGBT women and men, people. Also the idea of how we honor the leadership of women in the Catholic Church, come to the top of many of our communities. But when I read the Instrumentum Laboris and when I pay attention to the Synod, I believe that there are three things that I see as the emerging or perhaps the most exciting issues, and this is not about order of importance. This is about the level of excitement. As Roman Catholics, we believe in the Holy Spirit moving the church at every time in history. So I think that the best reading of the Synod and of this entire document and process is, where is it that the Holy Spirit is really moving the church and the hearts of the people? And there are three areas in which I believe that's happening, and that makes me excited. One, I think that the Instrumentum Laboris is literally inviting us, or the synod process is literally inviting us to be an authentically listening church, a church that listens. Now, everybody claims to do listening sessions. Every Catholic would say, of course I listen to my parishioners. Of course I listen to my students. Of course I listen to the families. Of course we're listening to the world as we read newspapers or as we read social media. And everybody claims to listen. But I think that the synod process is forcing us to ask the question, are you really listening? Are we really listening to one another? And the fact that young people, as the document indicates, feel excluded, that they feel invisible. The fact that large sectors of the church are walking away from institutional life. The fact that people feel a disconnect with their leaders and their structures. To me, those are symptoms that we are not listening to one another yet, that we have imposed models of being church in the United States of America and the rest of the world, that actually built upon clericalism or hierarchy, an idea of hierarchy, a top-down approach that takes actually little from the grassroots communities. So the first takeaway, I think, is precisely that is an invitation for us to be an authentically listening church, a church that creates spaces and where we listen to one another with respect, but not listening with a tokenistic approach, but listening so we can all learn from one another. And in the process of listening, we become community. And that's the Holy Spirit at work. The second area where I see...
Well, just one comment on that. So what stands out to me that's kind of interesting is it required a little bit of actual listening to realize how much listening is needed. Yes. Right? Without any of listening in the first place, you wouldn't realize how desperately people need to be listened to.
Absolutely. Anyway. And actually, thank you for saying that, because there is a temptation sometimes on many of us who are theologians or teachers or members of the hierarchy, who just simply ask the silly question, what can someone, who is in a marginal place or who is not a theologian or who is not ordained, say about Catholicism, And the fact is, a lot. I mean, these people are baptized. They have the Holy Spirit, everyone. So yes, there is a desire. I mean, I think that there is something that we can learn from this process, is that there's a desire of people wanting to tell, not just the hierarchy, but to share with their own sisters and brothers how they dream the church, how they want to be church. And again, that is exciting. I mean, a lot of churches, actually complain that people don't care about what's going on in them. Now, here we have a church where actually people do care and they want to express it, but we have to listen. We got to create the spaces for listening.
Yeah.
The second area where I see excitement emerging from this synod is, if you go through the Instrumentum laboris, it is hard to miss, but sometimes we miss it, and it is the fact that we are being invited into grounding this entire conversation in a spirituality, So, I mean, this is more about than politics, this is not just politics. And this is a temptation that we have in the US as well, that we reduce everything to politics, or to who wins on the right or who wins on the left, who scores points here, who scores points there, who gets their issue discussed or not discussed, and so on, And I think it is a very humane and also superficial understanding of what it means to be church. The Instrumentum laboris very clearly, tells us that we need a spirituality of dialogue, the spiritual listening, the spiritual dialogue, that we need to cultivate these predispositions so we can actually imagine the church together. But that's not going to happen by beating each other, with who wins, who doesn't win, or who loses, and so on. I think it's going to be more about, this is more about how do we grow in our discipleship, in our relationship with God and Jesus Christ, and at the same time, how do we build community horizontally. So that aspect of spirituality to me is fundamental. And then the last thing, James, that I see emerging, and actually gets me, very, very excited is that the document is inviting us to be attentive to the people who struggle. The people who struggle. It's more than being excluded or feeling excluded, because the question of exclusion is a question of power. Someone excludes someone, or someone doesn't have access to X or Y. And that is an important question, but that's not the only one. But beyond the question of power and inclusion or exclusion is the question, the reality that there are people who, whether they're included or excluded, are really struggling. Immigrants, refugees, the poor, the sick, the elderly, people who are struggling because of the changes in the climate worldwide, people who are losing their jobs in these inhumane economic structures that rule our world. These are people who have no choice about being included or excluded. These are people who have no choice about the dynamics that happen at the macro and local levels. These are people who are de facto struggling. And we cannot be church. We cannot be a listening church. We cannot be a church of disciples if we ignore the plight of these people. And the Instrumentum laboris, and I think that is very key, in terms of asking us to engage in dialogue about synodality, so we can become a church that doesn't ignore those people. And that actually is part of the many documents that came from the different countries, from the different continents. It is very clear we cannot be a church just that is distracted with issues of only power or only structures. It is about being a church, particularly that makes a preferential option and as an option for the vulnerable.
Yeah, and that's actually how I came through the document to see the question of LGBT inclusion. They are one case of people that are in that kind of a situation where they have struggles and problems, but what the Synod seems to really be doing is to capture all of those people, like you described, of every kind of marginalization and difficulty and suffering in the world.
Yes, indeed.
So both I looked at both the North American document as well as the Instrumentum Laboris, and both of them talk a lot about the importance of formation and how people need formation in general. They need formation over the course of their whole life. People detected that they need more formation around, what the meaning of the sacrament of baptism is in terms of its charisms and vocations. But also, and probably pretty obviously, people need formation to practice in a synodal church, to engage in processes of synodality. So what do you see as being opportunities, or like where are the places where we can start to offer more formation for people? Where can that come from? What do you see that looking like?
We cannot lose sight of the fact that the Synod on synodality, actually follows in the footsteps of the Synod on the Synod of the New Evangelization, which actually took place 15 years ago or so, and we have been talking about the new evangelization since the late 1970s, early 1980s. So for nearly 4 decades or so, the concept of the new evangelization has been central to the mindset, to the imagination of Roman Catholics throughout the world. And the new evangelization, is this calling to the entire body of baptized women and men, disciples of Jesus, to renew our discipleship, to renew what it means to be a disciple. So that's at the bottom of it. We cannot take for granted the fact that we are baptized, or that one day we went through a catechesis of initiation, or that one day we took a class here and there, a Bible course, and that makes us Catholic. There needs to be more. And one of the challenges that we have in our contemporary world is that, prior to, say, the 1940s or so, maybe earlier, it was okay for people to call themselves Christian or Roman Catholic, okay, and not worry that much about how much you knew about your faith, how much you understood about your faith, because there was a cultural kind of context that gave you, some protections, the protections about religion, protections for religion, protections about values, or traditional values, traditional understandings of Christianity. And if you lived, say, in Asia, in certain parts of Asia, certainly in Latin America, certainly in Europe, or in certain parts of Africa, well, you could take that for granted. But today we're living in a pluralistic world shaped by globalization and multiple forces, And the truth is that with access to media, technology, means of transportation that takes us from one place to another, people moving around, the influence of secularizing forces, and so on. So the bubble that we might have called Catholic society or Christian society has bursted, okay? And that's everywhere, even in countries, in continents where Christianity is beginning to grow. It's not growing with, with proof, with a context where actually people are not being exposed to these forces that sometimes are not too friendly to religion. So I think that this synod is reminding us, and that's what people are saying, because the Instrumentum laboris pretty much captures the desires of the many communities throughout the world. And what they are saying is, it is hard to be a Christian today. It is hard to actually enter into this set of competing proposals out there without knowing what it is that I, as a Christian, stand for, okay? And many millions of Roman Catholics actually are poorly catechized. And I think that that's where the Synod is doing. The Synod, in a sense, to me, is an exercise of diagnosing how poorly catechized we all are. It is a way of diagnosing how little we know about our faith, about our structures, about our church, and so on. And then together, rather than putting that in the hands of only the catechists or only the clergy or only the ordained and so on, but it's like everybody, in listening to one another, should start figuring out, how can we be better parents? How can we be better teachers? How can I be a better professional who is a Roman Catholic? How can I be a better educator to the children of my community? And on and on and on. So formation to me is that invitation from a synodal perspective to be a better disciple. And that's where any program of formation that emerges from this needs to be precisely that, a renewed effort to better discipleship, and from the community of disciples, then some of them will be called or will be responding to the calling to be leaders. But it's not going to be the other way around. A master's degree in theology doesn't make you a good Christian, a good Catholic. A PhD in theology doesn't make you a good Christian or a good Catholic. Some theologians, many I hope, are really good disciples. But I think that the formation that is mostly needed here is formation that brings people into falling in love with Jesus Christ, with the faith community, with the tradition, and then from that love, consider the possibility of leading in service.
That's sort of, sometimes I think, yeah, like you're saying, it's putting things in a reverse order sometimes of how we think about it. We want people will get their education, then they'll become of service.
I gotta tell you, if a master's degree or some type of education or a certificate that you get in a parish or a diocese, will make you better Christian, just without moving a finger, well, we should be given a lot of those, that's not a problem. But I think it really needs to start with, formation for discipleship.
Yeah. And then, people who are well-formed disciples will be better equipped to discern what kinds of service that they will be able to offer the church.
Without a doubt. Without a
doubt. So one other thing I wanted to check in with you about, again, looking through the Instrumentum laboris, there are a number of places that call for, reflecting on the global crisis of sexual abuse in the church as perpetrated by clergy in particular, and how the Synod can accomplish something towards the goals of some justice and restoring trust with the faithful around this issue. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what role the Synod might play in addressing this problem, what hope there might be for that, what that might look like.
Yeah. Well, there is no doubt that the sexual abuse, perpetrated by clergy on vulnerable people, especially children, has scarred many communities, and the effects have been very, very, negative at all senses. Lives destroyed. The cover up, really, literally, broke the trust that people had in the institution. But it doesn't mean that we should get rid of the institution. Doesn't mean that we should get rid of the entire Catholic apparatus and so on. It means that this is a calling for us to be better Christians, to be better human beings, to be better disciples. And one of the dynamics that was always named in the midst of this crisis was the poor quality of listening to the victims, to the families, to the advocates. In some cases, they were listened to with lawyers, who eventually will kind of tie their hands so they could not continue to dialogue on these matters. Sometimes they were listening to in contexts where somebody will take notes and then will archive, whatever happened, and then nothing else was done. And in many cases, they just simply did not listen. They just did not listen. They did not listen to experts. They did not listen to the victims and other pieces. It is also true that earlier, when a lot of these cases began to emerge, in the public eye, the institution, unfortunately, was listening to the wrong voices, voices that were perhaps using psychology to give poor advice, or voices that were listening to politicians or donors or lawyers that were more interested in protecting the structure, the institution, or some funding, monies, and then they failed to listen to the victims, to the community, and to those voices of reason that were asking for a stop, for an end to all these dynamics. So, James, I think that the Synod process, the Synod process, and I'm going to repeat myself a little bit on this, but it comes down to creating a culture of authentically listening to one another. But this time, it is the mutual listening of the community, in which the clergy and the laity and the vowed religious and everyone, is sitting at the table, and we become the checks and the checks and balances for one another. We become the people who, is not only the clergy making decisions about church life, it's not only the laity making decisions about church life, it is not only those who work in churches or in universities or pastoral institutes making decisions about church life, but it's about all of us together creating those spaces, sometimes in a representative way, sometimes in the daily dynamics of church life, sometimes in the context of the family. But we all need to create these spaces, because that's what happened with the sexual abuse crisis, in which clergy and non-clergy were involved. We need to say, but we failed to listen to one another. We failed to have clear paradigms or clear patterns, clear criteria to how we were going to listen, the good and the bad, the good and the bad. So a listening church, a church that is an expert in the practice of spiritual listening and spiritual dialogue, emerging from this synodal process, to me, could be one of the antidotes, and also an opportunity to heal the effects of sexual abuse that has taken place in our communities.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. It's interesting to think of how something that is just such a simple and obvious component of everyday life, listening, but if it really authentically and sincerely gets applied, it has, such potential for all kinds of good fruit, really.
And in the process of listening, if I may actually add a couple of thoughts here, it also has, connects with the question of accessibility. I kind of smile because I, in my own busy life, sometimes become inaccessible to my own students, inaccessible to people who may want to speak with me, or who may want to tell me something that is important for my work to be better, and so on.
Yeah.
But I'm also thinking that sometimes our bishops, sometimes our priests, sometimes our own theologians, sometimes our Catholic school teachers and administrators, or administrators in universities, we have become so distant from people in the everyday, from people in the neighborhoods, from people in the churches. And there are so many pastoral leaders who function like, hard to reach bureaucrats. To make an appointment with a theologian, or to make an appointment with a bishop or a priest, you gotta wait months. Sometimes you gotta wait, and for the right moment, and not everybody will actually get access to some of these people in the institution. And I think that the synodality process is, or the synodal process, is literally an invitation for us to find better ways to connect. I don't think that it should be too difficult to find my bishop, and find a moment, to talk. Of course, a bishop cannot speak with everybody, but at least there should be a way, if the bishop cannot speak with me, at least to say, I should be able to speak with this other person who will actually bring the message to the bishop, But we really need to create systems of, that bring us more, closely to one another, because there is no listening. If a bishop doesn't know what's going on in his diocese, if an administrator in a university or a Catholic school or a parish doesn't know what's going on with the people they are serving, then we just keep repeating the same mistakes. So a synodal church is a church of proximity, and it's a church where everybody has access to everybody in the best possible way.
I think that's exactly right. And I think that is like the bigger picture of what this synod on synodality is trying to do, is to help the church as a whole, and also like the local churches figure out how to accomplish that. Both first to figure out that they need to accomplish that, and then second to figure out how they can accomplish that more. Well, I want to thank you for making yourself available to me today in this way.
It's a pleasure.
It's been great to talk with you, and I really appreciate your insights. And I look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Thank you very much, James. Okay.
All right. Take care.
Take care. You too.